10 biggest differences between Fire and Blood and House of the Dragon Episode 5. Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Terry and this is Marvelous Videos. Well, that episode got a bit uncomfortable to say the least. When we think of royal weddings, our minds tend to work a bit like Sansa Stark's. The balls, the tourneys, the feasts, the glamour, those are the things we expect to see from a royal wedding ceremony. But this is the Game of Thrones universe, and it's bad luck in this universe to have a wedding without controversy, political intrigue, and at least one horrific death. By that metric, Ryan Condal and Miguel Sapochnik over-delivered because We Light the Way had all that and more. While the episode itself focused on the consequences of the fiery passions of the Targaryens, its overarching focal point was House Hightower, and that fact was solidified when Alicent appeared at her stepdaughter's wedding feast. But as is the case with every episode of the series, there were some major differences between episode 5 and the source material, and we're here to break them all down. So, spoiler alert, if you haven't watched it yet, there will be a lot of spoilers in this video. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Now, let's begin.
I knew you couldn't finish. Craven!
Daemon doesn't kill his wife Rhea Royce. She dies in a hawking accident in Fire and Blood. The opening shot of episode 5 takes us through the beautiful hills of the Vale of Arryn and introduces us to Prince Daemon Targaryen's long-estranged lady wife. At first glance, Rhea Royce is everything that a woman striving to make it in a man's world in the medieval era should be. She's strong, fond of hunting, the ruling lady of Runestone and head of House Royce despite being a woman, and prefers to spend her time all by her lonesome, catching game instead of spending it in the company of cousins who want her seat for their own. So it didn't surprise us that her reunion with her husband was a blunt and haughty affair. What did surprise us is how the conversation ended, because by the time Lady Rhea realized why Daemon was in the Vale, it was too late for her. He had already spooked her horse enough to throw it off balance, and when Rhea went to draw her bow, Daemon helped her horse fall back on itself, thereby ensuring Rhea cracked her skull on the stones below. He moved in to finish the job and thought better of it at first, but when his soon-to-be ex-wife taunted him by saying she knew he couldn't finish, he obliged her final request and caved her head in himself. This is a logical outcome based on the way the show has set up Daemon and Rhea's relationship, but it's also a far cry from what happened in Fire and Blood, because there he wasn't even present in Westeros, let alone Runestone at the time of his wife's death. As mentioned in our 10 differences video for last week's episode, after Daemon's scandalous night out with Rhaenyra, he's banished to the Vale and his lady wife by King Viserys. In Fire and Blood, however, he's exiled from Westeros and forced to return to his kingdom in the Stepstones. The Lady Rhea passes away in 115 AC after she falls from her horse whilst hawking and cracks her skull on a rock. She lingers for 9 days and only regains enough strength to rise from her bed in the final hour of her life before collapsing dead. Daemon is at his seat in Bloodstone when he receives word of his wife's passing, after which he mounts Caraxes and flies to Runestone ostensibly to put her to rest. But he ends up making an attempt to claim it as his own seat. The differences from Fire and Blood continue with the entire Daemon and House Royce subplot, as it's Rhea's cousin, not her nephew, who is vying for her seat and competing with her husband. When Daemon first arrives at Runestone, he promptly requests that the seat be granted to him in accordance with the laws of inheritance, as they relate to married lords and ladies, whilst collecting all the incomes from their lands and keeps. His request is denied with a stone face, and when Daemon moves to petition the overlords of the Royces, House Arryn of the Vale, he's shut down once again and warned that he's unwelcome in the former kingdom of the mountains. House of the Dragon appears to be taking the matter far more personally, as they not only had Daemon finish off his lady wife, but also brought the cousin in question to court to make his accusations. It'll be interesting to see how they take it forward, given the fact that Lord Lionel Strong, the new Hand of the King, is present to hear their heated discussion and gives Daemon a look that is equal parts disgusted and terrified.
As did her father. Your informant was wrong. An honest mistake, perhaps, but I did not foresee this.
Should have.
Alicent didn't betray her father in Fire and Blood. She was on his side from the beginning and was pressing Aegon's claim. The last episode of House of the Dragon showed us Alicent choosing to trust her friend over her family without knowing the whole truth of the matter. This episode showed us the consequences of that. In a way, Otto Hightower's dismissal was instigated by Alicent herself. She chose to question Rhaenyra when she shouldn't have even been in the room in the first place, and she took it upon herself to clear her sister's name, despite Viserys being completely aware of the true nature of the blood of the dragon. This is what makes her farewell to Otto such a conflicting scene. Because while we know Otto is clearly trying to manipulate the king into letting his bloodline be associated with the Iron Throne, he does love his daughter and is scared of the danger he's put her in, even if he can't say it in as many words. And the worst part is, this is created entirely for the show, because in Fire and Blood, father and daughter operate as a unit. Archmaester Gildain took into consideration many different sources when writing his history of the Targaryen kings, and all accounts agree that it was Queen Alicent who began pressing her children's claims over Rhaenyra's, and Sir Otto served as her loudest proponent. By the time Alicent's second child by Viserys, Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen, had been born, the Hand had hectored his king about the matter of succession so much that he was relieved of his duties and sent back to Old Town. Nonetheless, his hectoring had succeeded in sowing the seeds of the creation of the party that would eventually come to be known as the Greens. After Otto's departure, Alicent took it upon herself to see that her son would inherit the Iron Throne, and though all accounts agree that her relationship with Rhaenyra was amicable at first, it broke down soon after she herself started birthing heirs one after the other. House of the Dragon gives us a harsh loss of innocence of Alicent's character arc instead, which we think is far more intriguing. Her conversation with Otto Hightower reveals to us that even though she's aware of the fact that she and her children would be in danger when Rhaenyra ascends the throne, she's choosing to be blind to it due to her love for her childhood friend, and perhaps a bit of guilt for marrying her father as well. Alicent is also cognizant of what will happen if she doesn't make a move to secure her own political position, but she's still resisting making that choice due to the love she has for Rhaenyra. It's also the reason she doesn't insistently press her son's claims, despite knowing that it's stronger than Rhaenyra's. That innocence that she tries to cling on to is later shattered with a white shield by Sir Criston Cole, who ends up confirming her suspicions, but in the worst way possible. But nowhere in Fire and Blood is there a mention of stepmother and stepdaughter getting along so well that they would actively lie on each other's behalf. Remember that there's a 9-year age gap between Rhaenyra and Alicent in Fire and Blood, so even a close friendship seems unlikely to have developed between the two of them, much less sisterhood that compels them to defend each other. Well, one of them anyway. Otto's dismissal in the books came following his incessant hectoring regarding the matter of succession, and his daughter would end up taking things a few steps further before and after his dismissal. Though House of the Dragon is gearing towards that same power dynamic from the books, it will come following a significant time skip, a decade if the trailer for episode 6 is to be believed. We'll miss out on quite a bit of court intrigue, yes, but House of the Dragon has shown that it's capable of handling time skips much better than anyone likes to give it credit for. It's just a matter of waiting for next week to roll around. King Viserys didn't travel to Driftmark personally to propose the royal match. As a king, Viserys is probably the most relatable on-screen monarch we've ever seen. The guy just wants to spend his life in peace and happiness, but can't for the life of him catch a break. If it isn't his brother who's giving him a migraine, it's his hormonal 18-year-old daughter, and last episode, he finally put his foot down and made what is potentially the strongest decision of his life. He followed it up by sailing to high tide personally to propose the match, something that a strong king would have never thought of doing. But then again, Viserys has never been one for projecting strength when he has his mind set on something. He didn't even mind the fact that Lord Corlys Velaryon, one of his sworn vassals, didn't arrange a proper welcome for him following his arrival to Driftmark, which itself is quite surprising, because the king was not known to leave King's Landing unless the matter could not be deferred to someone else. Fire and Blood holds a far more, shall we say, traditional account of the matter of Rhaenyra's betrothal, where the entire small council is involved in the deliberations as the match affects the entire realm and not simply Rhaenyra herself. After going through multiple courtship progresses and entertaining dozens of prospects, Viserys and his councillors settle on Sir Laenor Velaryon, and the wedding proposition was made in a grand fashion, no doubt, given the fact that King Viserys didn't count coppers when it came to matters of celebration, but we doubt he went to Driftmark himself to make the match certain. We say this because 1. There is no mention of such a thing in Fire and Blood, and considering the fact that a king leaving his seat is a major deal in a kingdom, it should have been recorded in Gildane's histories, and 2. This scene was most likely arranged in such fashion to show just how disrespected House Velaryon felt by House Targaryen's actions. In Fire and Blood, it's recorded that Lord Corlys Velaryon suffered 3 slights to the glory of his family and his personal pride. The first was when his wife, Princess Rhaenys, was passed over in favour of Prince Baelon in 92 AC. The second was when his son Laenor was passed over in favour of Viserys in 101 AC. And the third was when Viserys chose Alicent Hightower over his own daughter Laenor Velaryon. After suffering the first slight, Corlys resigned himself from the small council and took his ships back to Driftmark. The second slight came after rumours started swirling throughout the Seven Kingdoms that the Sea Snake was preparing his ships in order to defend Laenor's rights. And after the third slight, House Velaryon effectively began boycotting the Iron Throne, starting by not showing up for the marriage and then escalating it by aligning themselves with Daemon and launching the War for the Stepstones. House of the Dragon, of course, has taken a much different route in getting to this point, but they have arrived nonetheless, and Corlys not preparing a welcome party for Viserys is basically him showing his own pettiness. When Rhaenys was passed over in favour of Viserys in House of the Dragon's version of the Great Council of 101 AC, his pride was wounded, but he didn't retract his service. That came when Viserys rejected the match between himself and Laenor, which explains the Velaryons' absence from the royal wedding. All that remained was for Corlys to show up Viserys at an important event, and what better way to do that than to ignore your king upon his arrival to your home? If Ned Stark had done this to Robert Baratheon in the first episode of Game of Thrones, we might not have had a series to talk about, even though Ned and Robert loved each other quite a bit. The disrespect Corlys shows Viserys and his treatment of it as a mild annoyance is just one of the many ways in which House of the Dragon tells you that he's unfit to be king, and we agree with Lord Lionel Strong in that 2 boys playing at swords in the yard is no fit way to welcome a High Lord, let alone king of all 7 kingdoms.
That we perform our duty to our fathers and to the realm.
Rhaenyra is far more understanding of Sir Laenor Velaryon's tastes. If you've seen our origins video for Sir Laenor Velaryon, then you'll know that he's pretty much an archetypal callback to Renly Baratheon from the main A Song of Ice and Fire series. In fact, his lover, Sir Joffrey Lonmouth, is even called the Knight of Kisses, just how Sir Loras Tyrell is called the Knight of Flowers. So it's great to see that House of the Dragon is not afraid to explore the unsaid truths of George R.R. Martin's creations, but what was surprising was how understanding Rhaenyra was of Laenor's preferences, because Fire and Blood makes it very clear that even if they got married, Sir Laenor would be nothing more than a royal consort, and that their marriage itself is not something that the princess was thrilled about in the first place. Episode 4 showed us that Rhaenyra was learning how to get her own desires and wishes fulfilled by manipulating people and actually playing the Game of Thrones. One of the instances that showed us how much she had learned was when she immediately agreed to marry Sir Laenor when Viserys brought his name up as a means to fulfill her duty, whereas in Fire and Blood she could scarcely stand the idea of marrying him. Archmaester Gildane notes in his histories that when the match was proposed, the princess initially rejected it, appalled at the thought of marrying a man with his tastes. Rhaenyra reportedly told her father that her half-brothers would be more to his taste when the betrothal was floated to her, and it took Viserys threatening her position as heiress to change her mind about the marriage alliance. That is a drastic departure from what happens in episode 5, where Rhaenyra is extremely comfortable with a marriage of convenience provided they both get to do what they want to do, or rather, who, to be more precise. This might seem like a small nitpick, but it actually matters a lot when you consider the overall portrayal of Rhaenyra's character in House of the Dragon. Fire and Blood makes her out to be more of a daddy's princess, the realm's delight, the girl who got whatever she wished for, the pampered princess of the 7 kingdoms. Rhaenyra's initial rejection of Laenor based on these grounds lends further credence to this perception, but by the time their marriage was made official, the whole realm knew it was just to strengthen the bonds between the first two houses of Westeros. By contrast, Laenor and Rhaenyra are in agreement when it comes to the topic of living their lives the way they want to, and can even put up an affectionate front for the masses if the first half of the wedding dance sequence is anything to go by. This gives a medieval story a rather modern sense of sexual preferences and their acceptance, which isn't uncommon for the world of Thrones. Most of you will recall Olenna Tyrell's admission to Tywin Lannister about what kind of swords her grandson liked to play with, and her subsequent line of inquiry into Tywin's own sexual past, one of the only times we saw the Lion of Lannister positively flustered by a political rival. Rhaenyra seems to be willing to continue that trend with Sir Laenor, and personally, we're glad that this is the route the show is choosing to take, even if that means we lose out on the rare dialogues from the books making it into the show.
Will I be remembered as a good king, Lionel?
King Viserys' medical condition in House of the Dragon is far worse than it was in Fire and Blood. From the very first episode of House of the Dragon, it's been made clear to us that King Viserys is a man who is fighting an infallible foe, disease. Though Fire and Blood does tell us that the king would cut himself while sitting on his throne, there is only one concrete instance of it happening, which takes place in 127 AC, over a decade after Rhaenyra's marriage. King Viserys slips and cuts his hand on the blades of the Iron Throne down to the bone, which leaves him with an infection so bad that it requires amputation. We suspect you'll see this scene play out in some form in the next episode, but the amputation that follows it has already taken place. House of the Dragon is taking its time to show us that Viserys, though always good-natured and intentioned, is ultimately the wrong choice for being king of the Seven Kingdoms. He started the series with a back wound from sitting on the throne, and by the time we saw him take his pleasure in episode 4, he was more likely to be called King Scab, a nickname the Mad King had, than King Viserys, because of how many cuts he had sustained from the Iron Throne. We got the answer as to why Viserys has been slowly dying in front of our eyes last week from Paddy Considine himself, and it turns out the answer is a form of leprosy. Yes, in House of the Dragon the king is suffering from leprosy, which is why his wounds are not healing on time, and you see his entire left arm covered with hideous, wart-like protrusions all over. This explains why his nose started to bleed during the final stages of the wedding ball, and also why he was so sick throughout episode 4. What it doesn't explain is why the showrunners chose to go down this path, because in Fire and Blood, Viserys losing his fingers to a disease was yet another way of showing you how politics worked in Westeros. Grand Maester Mellos was doing his best to save Viserys' fingers, but by the time he gave up, the king had 2 fingers that looked like they had the flesh-eating disease. It was only when Rhaenyra's personal maester Gerardis took over the king's care and amputated his fingers that his condition improved and he returned to full strength. This might have been George's way of showing us that the Grand Maester conspiracy is a real thing, and if anything, Otto's words to Alicent before his departure confirms it. He seems to know that the king will die soon, and the fact that Mellos keeps insisting on leeching instead of listening to his acolyte Orwyle, who replaces him as Grand Maester in the books, indicates some form of complacency between him and Otto. Go back and re-watch all his scenes from episode 1 and you'll see what we mean. It appears as though Viserys' worst medical condition in House of the Dragon is not just an allegory for him being unfit for kingship, it's also a soft confirmation for the fact that the Hightowers are most likely manipulating all the houses all the time, thanks to their patronage of the Grey Rats, as Lady Dustin calls them, in A Dance with Dragons. One must also take into account at this point the fact that Daemon didn't contract grayscale from a man confirmed to have been suffering from it, whereas Viserys is dying due to a disease that is readily curable in the modern world. It's said that Targaryens are unlike normal people and they don't fall sick easily. House of the Dragon seems to have taken the concept of the blood of the dragon and made it parallel the concept of some Starks being born with the wolf's blood. These are Targaryens and Starks who are born with a fiery nature and a tendency for magic. If this deduction is correct, then Viserys catching a common disease and Daemon avoiding a highly contagious one is yet another way of showing us that Viserys is no true dragon, and his death, which is seemingly set to be at the hands of this disease, will simply reinforce that belief. Daemon does not attend Rhaenyra's wedding in Fire and Blood. One of the biggest changes from book to screen wasn't a character that was taken out of the narrative, it was a character that was added to it, and that's none other than our favourite rogue Prince Daemon. He turned up all smiles and mischief after killing his lady wife in the opening scene of episode 5 to attend his beloved niece's wedding, but the fact that he was even there is a departure from Fire and Blood, because when Rhaenyra was getting married, Daemon was still in exile on Bloodstone. In our first entry, we noted how Daemon's expulsion from King's Landing was handled differently in the show, so we won't get into that here. What we will address is why Daemon's presence at the wedding was crucial. It was to progress the story to the point it needed to be at 10 years later. If you guys were focused solely on the drama going on between Criston Cole and Rhaenyra Targaryen, and we don't blame you for that, then you might have missed a small interaction between Daemon and Laenor Velaryon where the latter all but asks him to marry her on the spot. He's also approached by Rhea's cousin, who accuses Daemon of killing her in front of the Hand, but falls silent when his intent to take over his late cousin's lands are exposed by Daemon, and he's challenged to meet the prince at the Eyrie when he petitions for Rhea's lands to Lady Jane Arryn. Both these interactions are important. In the case of the latter, it'll show you that despite being a Targaryen prince, Daemon's reputation precedes him everywhere he goes, and he truly is a yin and yang character. In the case of the former, it sets up another wedding, which we got a glimpse of in the trailer for episode 6 as well. In Fire and Blood, it's noted that after Daemon fails to petition for Runestone's ownership, he turns up at Driftmark where he, quote, falls in love with Lady Laenor Velaryon. The accounts differ as to whether this was genuine affection or whether Daemon did it to check his descent in the line of succession, but all agree that he met his wife-to-be at Driftmark and was married to her shortly after. House of the Dragon decided to save the production budget and mashed all these different locations into one, the throne room of the Red Keep. Daemon's attendance also served to further his story with Rhaenyra, which is far from over, and we even saw her call out his lust for power when he pulls her aside during the dance. But we all know how this relationship is eventually going to end, so the intriguing build to it has left us feeling pretty satisfied. Daemon's appearance at Rhaenyra's wedding is a glaring inconsistency with the source material, but also it perfectly sets up everything that needs to happen next, and thus merits a place on this list.
You're a fool.
Sir Joffrey Lonmouth does not get the Oberyn Martell treatment in Fire and Blood. One of the most plainly disturbing scenes in House of the Dragon so far came in the closing stages of episode 5, when Sir Criston Cole finally snaps. Throughout the episode, he has to grapple with the fact that he soiled his white cloak and sacrificed his honor for a princess who doesn't even love him and would prefer to treat him like a bedmate. His guilt, frustration and agitation are turned up to 11 when he confesses his sins to Alicent and is only thanked for the truth. And when Sir Joffrey Lonmouth closes in on him and whispers his secret into his ear looking for an understanding with the Dornish knight, he immediately assumes that he has been betrayed by the woman he loves, and that pushes him over the edge. He tackles the Knight of Kisses to the ground and pummels his face with so many punches that it leaves him looking like Oberyn Martell following his trial by combat with the Mountain. This horrific explosion of anger and violence does match up with his overall demeanor during Rhaenyra's wedding in Fire and Blood, but what doesn't add up is the fact that he goes this berserk on Sir Joffrey, because in the books, Criston's assault on the Knight of Kisses came under the guise of competition. After being spurned by Rhaenyra, he came to absolutely loathe the princess and resolved to hurt not just her, but the people who surrounded her and their loved ones as well. During the melee arranged in honor of Rhaenyra and Laenor's wedding, Criston cracks Joffrey with his Morning Star so hard the Knight of Kisses never recovers from it, but it isn't as grisly as what House of the Dragon gave us. Joffrey doesn't die immediately, as is the case with most blunt force trauma victims. He lingers for a few days before finally kicking the bucket, and he most certainly wasn't brutalized to this extent. That would be Sir Harwin Strong, who is yet to earn his nickname from Fire and Blood, though he might do that in the next episode if the trailers are any indication. But given the fact that showing multiple tourneys would likely land House of Dragon's budget in the inflation bubble, it makes sense to express Sir Criston's frustration and anger in such a manner, because because it also reminds you that though he's a romantic at heart, he's a badass with his fists, and his fists are going to do the talking for him henceforth. Joffrey Lonmouth's death might seem like an unnecessarily violent one, but it makes sense to us, and we're just glad that we finally have a death scene that was actually queasy for a change. Having the Night of Kisses linger for close to a week with his beloved by his side would be a lot less impactful than having his face smashed in, and his lover grieve for him in front of the entire royal court, which is what we got.
Hear now their vows.
I am yours.
Rhaenyra and Laenor's wedding lasts far longer than the version given to us in House of the Dragon. When the wedding guests start pouring into King's Landing, Viserys proudly proclaims that there will be 7 days of feasting, bawling, jousting and revelry, but all that is cut short at the opening ball itself, thanks to Sir Criston's head-popping shenanigans. In the end, Rhaenyra and Laenor are wedded in an extremely private ceremony, with only their parents and the hand of the king in attendance as witnesses, while Sir Joffrey's blood became feed for the rats of the Red Keep. It was a powerful moment showing you the cost of teenage jubilance and the price of making light of the Game of Thrones, but it took away what could have been an even grander affair than the Purple Wedding. In Fire and Blood, Rhaenyra and Laenor's wedding isn't simply announced as a week-long celebration, it is one. All the tourneys, balls and feasts that Viserys promises in his speech to his subjects do take place, and it's at those tourneys that Sir Criston introduces his Morningstar to Sir Joffrey's skull. He also batters Rhaenyra's new rumoured lover and christens him with his uber-cool nickname, but as we noted earlier, we might get to see that in the next episode. This, yet again, is an indication of the sheer scale of things that House of the Dragon needs to adapt, but once again, it's also an indicator of the minimum fluff, maximum impact approach the showrunners are taking with the show, and we're loving it. No Game of Thrones wedding is complete without at least one death and something going horrifically wrong during the celebrations, and House of the Dragon married those two things to give us the shortest and grimmest wedding possible, discounting Sansa's marriage to Ramsay of course. But for me, Game of Thrones ended with season 4, so I don't know what you're talking about. While a full week's worth of gossip, intrigue and drinking contests at the royal court sounds like a treat to watch, we're just happy we weren't in there once Criston started throwing haymakers left, right and centre, and we're happier that the pretensions were dropped immediately afterwards and they just, as Viserys said earlier in the episode, got on with it. Alicent finally wears her green gown, but it's the wrong wedding celebration and also the only official faction colouring introduced to this series so far. You might have heard us referring to Rhaenyra and Alicent's party of supporters as blacks and greens in previous videos, and episode 5 must have explained to you why this was the case. So far, in season 1 of House of the Dragon, we've seen Alicent Hightower play the part of the dutiful daughter, wife, friend and queen. She dressed in blues before her marriage to Viserys and absolutely rocked that Targaryen black and red following her marriage to him. But what was conspicuously missing from her garments were the colours of her own house. While it's true that the High Towers of Old Town had more white, grey and scarlet in their banners on account of their fabled High Tower and its beacon flames, Lord Larys Strong correctly pointed out to us the significance of Queen Alicent's chosen garb for her daughter, stepdaughter's wedding day. The beacon of High Tower is one of the most prominent man-made sources of light on the western coast of Westeros. It's the only thing that guides ships into the Whispering Sound safely, and the tower itself acts like a sundial for the citizens of Old Town. But the true strength of the beacon comes in times of war. When Old Town means to call her banners, her beacon fires burn green, lighting the way of their sworn vassals and guiding them towards their path. Green is the colour that the High Towers use to essentially declare hostility with another party, and by fully embracing it, Alicent is showing the entire world that she will no longer be a pawn in the Game of Thrones, but she will rise to become a player. Her green gown that she wears to the wedding celebration is arguably one of the most important pieces of clothing in Westerosi history, other than Euron Greyjoy's sable cloak of course, which is why it's so frustrating for us to see it happen this late into the story. Because if we were sticking to Fire and Blood, Alicent should have worn her dramatic green gown in the last episode. In Fire and Blood, the Queen declares war on her stepdaughter's claim at the 5th anniversary of her wedding to King Viserys. It's an unwelcome affair for her, as all her champions, including her brother Gwaine, are unhorsed by Rhaenyra's champion Sir Criston Cole. But note is taken, and thereafter it does become custom to call her party the Greens, whilst Rhaenyra's party is called the Blacks for the rich black and red garments she wore to the same celebration. Not only is Rhaenyra dressed in those colours in episode 5, Alicent's timing is off by at least 2 to 3 years as well. House of the Dragon has flipped a few occurrences from the books on their heads to make it fit the story they're telling. Alicent calling Rhaenyra stepdaughter is the perfect foil for the book line that tells us she kissed her and named her daughter on her own wedding day. Still, the green gown being introduced in episode 5 is a massive game changer, one that we will see the ramifications of for the rest of the series. It's just a shame that it came at the wrong time for us.
It's not much different to combat.
We shall hope for a different outcome.
Sir Criston Cole's allegiances were not in flux at the time of Rhaenyra's wedding. They were pretty much set in stone. And we'll end this video by pointing out the fact that because the tourney aspect of Rhaenyra and Laenor's wedding was entirely cut, we didn't see Criston Cole let loose and show the realm exactly where his allegiance lay now, which were with Queen Alicent. In Fire and Blood, at Rhaenyra and Laenor's wedding tourney, Sir Criston Cole took it upon himself to make an impact, and that he did. He went after the royal couple's rumoured lovers and proceeded to beat both of them to within an inch of their lives. You've already seen what happened to Sir Joffrey, Laenor's lover. A similar fate awaited the son of the Hand of the King at the time, Sir Harwin Strong, but as we've mentioned already, that seems to have been moved to another episode because we don't want Criston to seem too much like Greg or Clegane now, do we? But there is a major difference even here, because while House of the Dragon shows us Criston becoming Alicent's man at the end of the episode, Fire and Blood tells us he was already there long before he officially became the most hated man at the royal wedding. Sir Criston Cole's rampage through the lovers of the royal couple was not completely unadorned. He wore the token of his new queen, Alicent Hightower, whilst dishing out the ungodly punishments that were his fists and weapons. His actions sent the entire royal court into a rage, and even Viserys was appalled by the actions of the Lord Commander of his Kingsguard, but the one person who was thrilled by all of this was Alicent, who made him her own sworn shield ever after. Given the nature of his assault and the outcome of it, we can assume that it was premeditated, and that would imply he was already in cahoots with the Queen, which is where yet another major departure takes place in the book-to-screen translation, as Criston Cole doesn't do anything untowardly until the very end when he snaps while on guard and protecting the princess he loves. In fact, he's so conflicted with his own actions over the course of the last episode and this one that he goes into the Godswood of the Red Keep after giving the Knight of Kisses their Oberyn treatment and tries to commit suicide when he's stopped by none other than Alicent, who is ostensibly there to name him her sworn shield. Though the overarching outcome of all these interactions remain the same, the core emotional struggles have been far more clearly defined in House of the Dragon than they could have been in Fire and Blood. Sir Criston spends the entire episode struggling with the fact that he thought the princess loved him, when in reality she only loved his member and doesn't make any political decisions until after exploding, whereas in the books he's Lord Commander of the Kingsguard and therefore not in a position to be losing his cool in front of every High Lord from the realm. Criston Cole knew what he wanted and where his loyalties lay when he entered Rhaenyra's wedding celebrations in Fire and Blood, but his conflicted status in House of the Dragon gives his character immense depth, and we honestly can't wait to see him go ham in the field. Marvelous verdict. All in all, episode 5 was a small step for Rhaenyra in the grand scheme of things, but a giant leap for House of the Dragon, or at least the setup for one. This is the last episode where we'll get to see Millie Alcock and Emily Carey play Rhaenyra and Alicent respectively, and we honestly don't want to see them go. If we were making House of the Dragon, the first episode itself would have been an entire season's worth of material, but alas we're not. But while we are sad to see these breakout stars leave our screen, we're also supremely excited to see their adult counterparts on screen. Episode 6 will ostensibly pick up nearly a decade after Rhaenyra's wedding, and a lot will have changed by then. Keeping these lists down to 10 major differences might not be enough next week, but we're up to the challenge, and besides, who doesn't want to watch the Westerosi version of Love, Death and Robots? Sorry, Dragons. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like, and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.
Rhaenyra of House Targaryen to be man and wife.